Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Today, we're going to talk about something particularly significant in American history, which is the frontier. Indeed, the significance of the frontier in American history is the title of a lecture, later turned into an article, and eventually into an entire book by the great American historian Frederick Jackson Turner. He originally gave this lecture at the Pan American Exposition in Chicago, celebrating the 400th anniversary of Columbus's discovery of the New World. And in it, he claimed that the existence of a frontier, of an area of unsettled land, into which Americans could continually expand, had been one of the most important features, not just of American geography, but of American history, and that in many ways it had created the American character. And there are several parts to this thesis, which is often referred to as the Turner Thesis or the Frontier Thesis, particularly on, say, AP exams. But even for people not studying for an AP exam, it gives us, I think, an interesting way to look at American history. And so it's worth talking about, even though there are those today, and for the past several decades, who've had several criticisms of Turner's thesis. In any case, Turner's argument was in that the frontier, an area of land into which we could expand, had made America different and special. An idea sometimes called American exceptionalism. And the idea that America is different from other countries, has perhaps a unique identity, even a unique mission in the world. And Turner said this came from the frontier. He argued that from the earliest days of American settlement, even with the English arriving in, say, Jamestown or Plymouth in the early 1600s, being far away from established authority and from social traditions, they were forced to start over. To tame the wilderness, people had to work together. And having to work together created, at least for a time, a sense of equality greater than these people had known in the past. And furthermore, being away from their traditional established authority meant that these American settlers on the frontier, or these settlers on the American frontier, as this does predate American independence, had to form a government of their own. The House of Burgesses in 1619 is the oldest representative body in what's now the United States. The Mayflower Compact, signed the next year, 1620, was an attempt by the Pilgrims to create a government for themselves. And both of these governments were, by the standards of their day, quite democratic, allowing, in Virginia, all property-owning men to vote. All free men to vote. That was later restricted to property-owning free men. In Plymouth and in Massachusetts Bay, adult male church members could vote. And as more and more colonies were created, each had some kind of representative government, a House of Burgesses, a General Assembly, a House of Commons, or something else, in which at least a relatively large portion of the population was able to vote for representatives of some sort, which of course came from the English tradition of a parliament, which, while again not especially democratic by today's standards, as property qualifications and other limits kept many people from voting, was still far more democratic than anywhere else in Europe at the time. And as settlers in these colonies in America moved further west, the coastal societies became more stratified, but people on the frontier, in the backcountry, began to press for rights again. Nathaniel Bacon's rebellion in 1676, as the people in the frontier of Virginia, in what today would be more or less central Virginia, shortly before you get to the Appalachian Mountains, but then the frontier, demanded more representation in the colonial government. To be sure, they also want the colonial government to kill more Indians to open up land for settlement, but that was expressing what the people wanted. From time to time, democracy does not give us ideal results, even if in general it gives us better results than any other system in the long run that we've discovered so far. Indeed, Bacon's rebellion is sometimes seen as prefiguring the American Revolution a century later. And while Bacon himself died of dysentery and some of the rebel leaders were executed, many became part of Virginia's upper class, and more representation, more recognition was given, at least to free white men on the frontier and elsewhere. One can argue the American Revolution, in and of itself, was people on the frontier, far away from royal authority, growing accustomed to a more egalitarian, more democratic system of government, and wanting to protect that when they felt that their liberties, their rights as Englishmen, or perhaps as Americans, were being threatened by the British government. So arguably the entire American Revolution was people on the frontier seeking greater equality and more democracy. Certainly Theodore Roosevelt claimed that the Watauga Association, created by American settlers in what's now Upper East Tennessee, living west of the Proclamation Line, was the first free and independent government created in America. And that's because they were on the frontier, arguably beyond the frontier of British settlement, and had to create a government of their own. That is something important. A notion is developed that it is all American to hate government, and that is not entirely true. As Americans moved west beyond the control of the existing government, they always created new governments, wanting law and order and justice, someone to protect their rights and their property, and manage relations between and among people. It is not American to be anti-government. At the same time, it certainly is American to be opposed to an unjust or a tyrannical or simply an ignorant government, unaware of the conditions of people living in the real world. As the frontier often was very different and distinct from kind of traditional government back east. And then, of course, once America was independent, we would see the same process. People would move west and have to create new governments of their own. One of the very few lasting contributions to American law of the Congress of the Articles of Confederation was the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, which laid out how to create new states, which was taken almost entirely into the U.S. Constitution in Article 4. And this would involve the people of a U.S. territory electing a government of their own, under the guidance, it is true, of an appointed territorial governor. Once enough people lived in a territory, though, they would elect a territorial legislature, which in turn would create a state constitution and send it off to Congress for approval, or possibly rejection. And so, as people moved onto the frontier again, not only did they have to create a new society and work side by side as they did it, creating a greater experience in equality and cooperation than more established society back east, they then had to quite literally work together to create a government, which, with their recent experience in working together, tended to be more democratic, more equal than the governments they had left behind. Our 14th state, Vermont, which may not seem like the frontier now, but kind of was when it became a state in 1791, was the first state to allow all white men to vote, whether or not they owned property. When Tennessee became our 16th state in 1796, it allowed all property-owning men, white or black, to vote, one of the very few places a black man could vote in America in the late 1700s. It is true you had to own property, but simply to vote it didn't matter how much you owned, and land was so cheap, pretty much anyone who wanted to own property could, almost abolishing property qualifications to vote. And so, as people on the frontier created more democratic governments, they then, under the U.S. Constitution, of course, elected men and eventually women who would first come from the frontier to return to the national capital, to Washington, D.C., and would kind of reinvigorate democracy, bringing those frontier ideals of equality and democracy back east. It would happen generation after generation. Again, each new wave of statehood on the frontier refreshing democracy in America and expanding democracy. And of course, this was often done through the creation of U.S. territories. But we'll see, too, many times when Americans on the frontier, outside the protection of their own government, created governments of their own. Vermont spent a time as a republic, having declared independence not just from Britain, but also from New York and New Hampshire, both of which claimed it at one point. And they did operate as a separate republic for some years, at one point even threatening to ally with Canada when they were annoyed by the United States, until President George Washington threatened to invade. As I already mentioned, the Watauga Association was created in 1772 in what would become East Tennessee. And before Tennessee itself was created, there was the attempt to create the state of Franklin in what's now East Tennessee, but then western North Carolina. When western North Carolina gave up its claims to the land in this area, but Congress did not accept those lands, and so the territory was left ungoverned for a few months. And so people here created their own government. There would be other cases. Of course, as Americans moved into the Mexican territory of Texas, at first at Mexico's urging, and later against Mexico's wishes, when Mexico tried to close their borders to all the immigrants coming in from the United States. The people of Texas, both of American and Mexican ancestry, who are also unhappy with Mexico's government, was created their own Republic of Texas, which 9 years later would join the United States. When American settlers in the Kingdom of Hawaii became unhappy with the Hawaiian government, admittedly mostly for issues related to their own financial power, they in turn overthrew the Hawaiian monarchy and created a Republic of Hawaii. The frontier, in some ways, would even provoke the Civil War, as Americans fought, in part over whether new territories in the West would allow slavery or prohibit it. Bleeding Kansas, which kind of prefigured the Civil War in the 1850s, was, in part, a war over which territorial legislature was the legitimate government for the territory of Kansas, and thus could submit a state constitution to Congress. Again, each wave of expansion promoted democracy. In the earlier days of the frontier, the late 1700s, the early 1800s, property qualifications for voting were abolished or never created in frontier states. And this would result in, say, Andrew Jackson being elected president, very much a democratic creature of the frontier. Even his vice president and next president, Martin Van Buren, although from the state of New York, was from what was then the frontier too, kind of from around Albany, which in those days was not quite the Wild West, but pretty close. As people moved further west, democracy expanded further. The first state to allow women to vote was Wyoming, in part, I'm sure, in hopes that women would simply move to Wyoming, but also because there was a greater sense of equality there. And all the early states to allow women to vote in any significant way were in the West. The first Congresswoman, Jeanette Rankin, was elected from the western state of Montana. A number of western states also elected women to their state legislatures. A few elected them as governors, before that happened anywhere in the East.